At night, a van pulled up to my neighbor's house, and heavy crates were unloaded from it. My dog growled, and I turned on my camera. What I recorded turned the entire neighborhood upside down. Let's start from the beginning. I had always believed that I lived in a wonderful neighborhood. My home was my fortress, and my loyal dog, Buster, was its guardian. He was friendly, but didn't like strangers. Like any good watchdog, he alerted me to every passerby, barking to signal that someone was approaching. His sharp voice was mostly heard in the mornings when people went out for walks and in the evenings when neighbors returned home. But his barking was never without reason and never lasted long. However, my neighbor, Mr. Collins, had a different opinion. He lived in the house across the street and made it clear from the moment we met that he didn't like dogs. Once he casually remarked, "Animals are too much responsibility, and they shouldn't be left without proper control." At the time, I didn't think much of it, but I soon realized that for him, even a single bark was a personal offense. One morning, as usual, I went outside to collect my mail and found an official notice from the Homeowners Association, HOA, in my mailbox. It stated that a complaint had been filed against me regarding constant noise, and if I didn't take action to resolve the issue within a week, I would be fined $500. "Is this a joke?" I muttered, rereading the letter. But of course it wasn't a joke. I knew exactly who had filed the complaint. Collins had already hinted several times that he didn't like the way Buster behaved. He claimed that my dog barked incessantly, which was far from the truth. Buster always reacted to movement beyond the fence but quickly calmed down. Besides, the neighborhood was full of other dogs, yet the complaints were only about mine. I decided not to let this slide and went to confront him. Approaching his door, I knocked. Footsteps sounded and the door cracked open before swinging wide. Collins stood in the doorway with his arms crossed over his chest and a slight smirk on his face. "Ah, it's you," he drawled, as if he had been expecting me. "Got my notice?" "Yes, and I want to understand why you filed the complaint. Buster doesn't bark for no reason, and I don't think he disturbs anyone enough to involve the HOA. Collins shrugged as if he didn't care. "That's your problem," he replied. "There needs to be order in our neighborhood. No one wants endlessly barking dogs." I tried to argue, but he cut me off. "The HOA is already on my side. You have a week to figure something out, or you'll be fined." His voice was dripping with smug satisfaction. I clenched my teeth. This wasn't fair. How could someone complain about a barking dog in a neighborhood where half the homes had pets? Why did Buster bother him so much? I walked away from his house, but my irritation didn't fade. This man enjoyed causing me trouble. But I wasn't going to give up so easily. Something told me there was more to his complaint than just the noise, and I was determined to find out what it was. After my conversation with Collins, I decided to pay closer attention to his house. His smirk, his smugness, it all hinted that he knew something I didn't. Maybe it wasn't Buster himself that annoyed him, but rather what Buster might have overheard or seen. For the first few days, I didn't notice anything unusual. Collins lived a secluded life, rarely going outside during the day and almost never interacting with the neighbors. But at night, when most of the neighborhood was already asleep, his house came to life. One evening, while walking Buster, I saw Collins talking to a man on his porch. Their conversation was too quiet to hear, but their serious expressions suggested they were discussing something important. Later that night, I noticed a black car pulling up to his yard. Two men stepped out, opened the trunk, and, after glancing around cautiously, carried several heavy crates into the house. They were clearly trying not to attract attention. Buster suddenly growled and started barking. At that moment, Collins immediately turned on the lights and looked out the window. I quickly ducked behind the bushes, holding my dog close. "Easy, boy," I whispered. "We need more information." The next 3 nights were quiet, but then it happened again. The same car arrived precisely at midnight, and more crates were brought inside. My camera captured everything. I was sure Collins was involved in something illegal, but before I went to the police, I needed more proof. I decided to be cautious. My investigation was just beginning. I knew I had to proceed carefully. I had photos of tire tracks, surveillance footage, and records of strange night visits, but it wasn't enough for the police. I needed undeniable evidence. I decided to call my friend Mark, who worked at the local police department. We met at a cafe outside the neighborhood to avoid drawing attention. I told him everything I had seen and showed him the photos and videos. "This looks suspicious," Mark said as he scrolled through the footage. "But without concrete evidence, we can't do anything. Do you have anything linking him directly to illegal activity?" "Not yet," I admitted, "but I know he's hiding something." Mark nodded. "Then gather more data. Maybe you can record what they're actually delivering. If it's something illegal, we'll have grounds for a search warrant." Over the next few nights, I carefully recorded all movements, documenting every visit in detail. One evening, I overheard a conversation from behind the fence. Collins sounded irritated. "They can't find out about this. It all has to go smoothly. Deliver the goods and leave." I installed an extra hidden camera closer to his house. A few nights later, the camera captured men carrying out large boxes with logos of unknown companies. When I handed the footage over to Mark, the police finally had enough reason to act. Soon, Collins's house was surrounded. The search uncovered a massive stash of illegal goods. The HOA, which had been so eager to support his complaints against me, suddenly turned their backs on him. I watched as he was led away in handcuffs, while Buster wagged his tail proudly, watching the scene unfold. Now I knew, sometimes, even a simple dog's bark could play a crucial role in uncovering secrets. Collins was arrested, but the consequences of his actions rippled through the neighborhood like waves on water. By the next morning, everyone was talking about it. Small groups of neighbors gathered outside their homes, whispering and casting glances at Collins's now eerily silent house. No one had expected that he was involved in something so serious. The HOA, which had previously supported his complaints, now rushed to distance themselves from him. The association's representatives held an emergency meeting, scrambling to explain their stance and assuring everyone that they had no knowledge of any illegal activity. However, the residents started asking uncomfortable questions. Why had the HOA covered for Collins? Why had they accepted his complaints so easily without verifying their validity? People demanded answers, and some even pushed for a review of the association's authority. I attended the meeting, watching with deep satisfaction. The same HOA that had tried to silence me now had to defend themselves. One of their representatives was forced to admit that many decisions had been made without proper investigation. In the end, they agreed to conduct an independent audit of the HOA's activities. Some neighbors who had once sided with Collins now switched their stance. One of them, an elderly man named Mr. Harrison, admitted that Collins had manipulated the rules multiple times to force people into submission. It turned out that he had used the HOA for personal gain, ensuring that fines were issued to those he disliked. Now, he had to face the consequences. A few days later, I received a letter from the HOA. It contained a formal apology for the false accusations against me and my dog, along with the cancellation of all previous fines. It was a satisfying confirmation that justice had finally prevailed. But most importantly, I no longer felt pressure. No one came to my door with complaints, and no one tried to intimidate me anymore. I could finally enjoy my home in peace, knowing that I had won this battle. However, changes were brewing in the neighborhood. Residents began actively discussing the need for HOA reforms. People realized how unchecked power could be used as a tool for control. A petition was started to review the regulations and even replace the association's board. This was the first step toward restoring fairness. I watched it all unfold with satisfaction. It seemed that people had finally recognized their own strength. No one wanted a repeat of what had happened, and now transparency in neighborhood management was a priority. No one would allow themselves to be manipulated again. A few weeks passed. Collins's house now stood empty, put up for sale. No one in the neighborhood was eager to buy it, knowing about its previous owner's reputation. Realtors came by occasionally, showing it to potential buyers, but with little success. It almost seemed like the house itself had absorbed the negative energy of its former occupant. As for me, I was finally enjoying the peace and quiet. Buster, my loyal companion, could once again roam the yard freely, barking without the fear of another complaint. It even seemed like he felt victorious in this whole ordeal. I spent more time outside, simply appreciating the tranquility that had been out of reach for so long. But perhaps the most rewarding change was the shift in our neighborhood's atmosphere. People became more united, more attentive to each other. After everything that had happened, neighbors started talking more, discussing important issues, and actually listening to one another. Some residents proposed a complete overhaul of the HOA to prevent future abuses of power. The idea gained traction, and soon a vote was scheduled to elect a new board. I decided to take part in these changes. Instead of ignoring the HOA like I had before, I realized that it was better to keep a close watch on their actions. I now understood that if power was left in the hands of people like Collins, problems were inevitable. I even joined an initiative group tasked with drafting a new set of regulations to ensure that such situations never happened again. At some point, I reflected on everything that had transpired, how a simple complaint about a barking dog had led to such a major revelation. Collins had tried to use the system against me, but in the end, he fell into his own trap. Justice had prevailed, and I had learned that even the smallest actions could lead to significant change. I glanced at Buster, who was lying on the porch, watching the street. He looked at me, wagged his tail, and barked. This time, I just smiled. Let him bark. He had earned the right to protect his home. Life had finally returned to normal. But now I knew one thing. If anyone ever tried to bring injustice into our neighborhood again, I wouldn't stay silent. And neither would my dog. The difference now was that I had the support of my neighbors, who had learned from this experience and would never allow themselves to be intimidated again. I took one last look at Colin's empty house. It was a symbol of the past we had all left behind. A new era was beginning, one that was fairer and more honest. And at last, I truly felt at home. Several months had passed since the neighborhood returned to its usual rhythm. However, the events surrounding Collins had exposed just how vulnerable a management system could be when left unchecked. The HOA, instead of protecting the interests of residents, had become a tool for manipulation. Many realized that such situations required systemic changes, not just a change in leadership. At first, the neighbors sought explanations from the former HOA board, but no answers came. People began to suspect that similar abuses had happened before, just that no one had been paying attention. The tension and frustration grew until an emergency meeting was held. By a majority vote, it was decided to bring in an external auditor to investigate the association's activities. The process was complicated and took several months. The findings were shocking. Not only did they uncover Collins' manipulations, but also excessive administrative spending, questionable contracts with contractors, and the improper use of residents' fees. These revelations caused a scandal. The previous HOA board resigned, and an interim working group made up of active community members took their place. For the first time in a long while, I felt that our neighborhood was truly changing for the better. The discussions now focused not just on problems, but on how to prevent similar situations in the future. Everyone understood that protecting their rights required not just courage, but continuous involvement in the community. At one of the first meetings of the new HOA, I saw more neighbors in attendance than ever before. People weren't just raising concerns, They were sharing ideas on how to improve our neighborhood. Some suggested starting a community garden. Others proposed organizing cleanup events, and one neighbor even came up with the idea of an annual festival to celebrate the unity of the residents. I also became more actively involved in the life of the neighborhood. Along with several other residents, we worked on creating new regulations to protect everyone's rights and prevent abuses of power. Now, every issue was addressed collectively, and all complaints required proper verification and fair consideration. Buster had become something of a local celebrity. Neighbors often came up to pet him and joke about how he played a key role in exposing Collins. That was especially heartwarming for me because Buster had always been more than just a pet. He was family. I even put up a small sign in my yard that read, "Protected by the best watchdog in the neighborhood." It was meant as a joke, but many neighbors took it seriously. As for Collins' house, it was finally sold. The new owner turned out to be a quiet and friendly man who got involved in the neighborhood from day one. He even offered to use his garage for storing equipment for future community events. It became a symbol of how even the most negative situations could lead to something positive if people worked together. I often thought back to that first complaint about Buster's barking and how things could have turned out differently. If I hadn't started paying attention, if I hadn't set up cameras, if I hadn't reached out to Mark, if the neighbors had remained indifferent, our neighborhood would have continued to suffer under manipulation and pressure. But we had proven that justice was possible when people stood up for their rights. Now, every time I took Buster for a walk, I felt a sense of pride, not just for him, but for our neighborhood and for the people who made these changes happen. We were no longer just neighbors. We had become a true community, strong, united, and ready to stand up for what was right.